Okay, so we're on to the third video of our 6 trig functions unit. And in this video, we're going to talk about if we're given specific information about a right triangle, we're going to find the 6 trig ratios, or be able to find some of the 6 trig ratios. So this one adds a level of difficulty. You can see in this example, using one trig ratio to find another. So we're going to find just sine and cosine, which is nice, given that the tangent is 4/3 and that cosine is less than 0. The key is for this section that you'll be given 2 pieces of information, and that helps you determine the quadrant. So your first step is to draw out the quadrants, and you're focusing on positive or negative. So since tangent is positive, I know that has to be either quadrants 1 or 3. Since they're saying cosine is less than 0, that's like saying it's negative, which cosine is negative in quadrant 3. So quadrant 3 is where I'm going to draw my triangle. Once I know that's the quadrant, then I draw in my triangle, once again connected to my x-axis, because theta is that reference angle, the angle from the x-axis. Now that I know that, I can use that tangent as opposite over adjacent. So the opposite side is 4, the adjacent side is 3. And finally, to find both sine and cosine, which is what we're looking for, we will need to find the missing side, which is the hypotenuse. So we kind of repeat the same process, but it's just a different starting point. So I do 3 squared plus 4 squared equals x squared, square root both sides, I get x equals 5. Once again, this is that 3, 4, 5 right triangle. Now, one thing before I keep going, or I would run into a problem, I need to look at these sides that I labeled. And again, we're technically starting from the origin. If I'm going from the origin this way, that's actually a -3. And then from here down is a -4. So we do have to pay attention to our signs when we label those sides. I forgot to do that on the front end. But that's important because tangent, because it's positive, it could be a negative divided by a negative as well. Once I have everything labeled, then this one just asks me to find sine of theta, which in the triangle is the opposite of the hypotenuse. So it's -4/5. And then it also asks me to find cosine. So I find adjacent over hypotenuse, which is -3. And I'm good. Okay, so I don't have to find all the trig functions. It doesn't ask me. So let's look at another example of that, or 2 more examples. Okay, so given that cosine of theta is -8/17, so again, the fact that it's negative is important, and cosecant, which means that sine of theta would have the same sign, so they're both negative. So cosine and sine are both negative in the third quadrant. So once again, I draw my triangle in the third quadrant. So you're always determining that quadrant first based on positives and negatives. Cosine is adjacent, so it's -8 this way. Over 17 is the hypotenuse. And once again, I will need to find my missing leg. So I call this x, so I'm going to do x squared plus -8 squared needs to equal 17 squared. So x is going to equal the square root of 17 squared plus -8 squared. When I type that in, I actually got that to be 15. Okay, so x is 15, so I label that. Now in this case, they just want me to find cosecant, so I usually find sine first just because that's how I like to think about it. Opposite over hypotenuse is, once again, this 15 though, because it's in this quadrant, needs to be negative, so it's -15 over 17. So my final answer for cosecant theta is -17 over 15. I'm done. Okay, so really it's about identifying the quadrant using the 2 pieces of information. And so one more example, tangent is negative and cosine is positive. So I have to find the quadrant where tangent is negative and cosine is positive. Well, tangent is negative in quadrants 2 and 4, and cosine is positive in quadrant 4. So we're talking about this quadrant down here. So that's where I draw my triangle. Tangent is opposite over adjacent. Now we do have to be careful with signs. So my opposite is 1, my adjacent is 2. Just one of those two has to be negative. So I think about how I moved in the grid. From here to here, I moved in the positive direction. From here to here, I moved in the negative. So the opposite side, then 1 is the negative. Once again, I would find my hypotenuse. So negative 1 squared plus 2 squared should equal x squared, square root of both sides. And for this one, I got that x equals the square root of 5. So I just left it at that. So then for the cosecant, again, I like to find sine first because that's the reciprocal function. And it's opposite, which is negative 1 over root 5, the hypotenuse. I don't even simplify that because the question didn't even ask me to find it. So I flip that negative root 5 1, or just negative root 5. And again, you could probably get away without doing this part and just doing that in your mind, but I like to show it. Why don't you pause the video here again now that you've seen 3 examples of this concept, and guided practice number 14. Once you finish, check your work here. So in guided practice 14, it's the idea that given a few pieces of information, find where the angle is and evaluate the specific trig function. So we're ultimately going to find cosine and cotangent, but first we need to pick the quadrant. Sine is positive and tangent is negative. So I'm figuring out the quadrants where sine is positive and tangent is negative. Well, since sine is my y value, we're talking about quadrants 1 and 2 for sine, and of those 2, tangent is negative quadrant. I draw my triangle up in quadrant 2. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse, so I have a 1 over 4. And this 1 is in the positive direction, so I keep that as a positive 1. The hypotenuse is always positive. Whatever I find for this value is going to be negative. So I find that value by doing 1 squared plus x squared equals 4 squared. When I look at that, I get x equals the square root of 4 squared minus 1 squared, so I get the square root of 15. So it's going to be negative root 15 over here. Now it wants me to find the cosine of theta. Cosine of theta equals adjacent, which is that negative root 15 over hypotenuse, which is 4. And then cotangent. So tangent is opposite over adjacent. So cotangent is going to be adjacent over opposite, which is negative root 15 over 1. Or I could just have negative root 15. So those are my answers for that one. This will be the end of video number 3. You do have one video left to learn a couple of small concepts.